June 15, 1987. Carlos Mendoza had refereed 847 professional matches. He'd seen fights, blood, broken bones. But nothing prepared him for what happened in the tunnel beneath Maracana Stadium that night. Pelé and Maradona had just finished their exhibition. 5,000 fans were still cheering above. Carlos was collecting his gear when he heard the first scream echo off concrete walls. He turned the corner and saw two of football's greatest legends in a way the world was never supposed to see them. One man on the ground, one man standing over him. And between them, something that would make Carlos question everything he thought he knew about heroes. The security cameras caught it all. For 36 years, Carlos kept quiet. The footage disappeared. The official story was written. But some secrets don't stay buried, especially when they're worth $50 million to the right buyer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carlos Mendoza's arthritis flared as he gripped the rusty gate key, the metal cold against his weathered fingers in the pre-dawn Buenos Aires chill. 36 years of carrying that secret had carved lines deeper than any referee's whistle ever could. The small football academy where he worked as groundskeeper was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic on Avenida Corrientes. He should have been thinking about the day ahead, marking the penalty areas, checking the goal nets, preparing the field for another group of hopeful teenage players. Instead, his mind drifted back to that tunnel, to the echo of concrete walls and the metallic taste of fear that had never quite left his mouth. The morning routine was his anchor now. Unlock the equipment shed, check the sprinkler system, rake the sidelines, simple tasks that kept his hands busy and his thoughts from wandering too far into the darkness of memory. But lately, the nightmares had been coming more frequently. Pelé's face, Maradona's broken expression, and that thing between them on the tunnel floor, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Carlos had tried everything to forget. Therapy, alcohol, even prayer, though he'd stopped believing in forgiveness years ago. How do you confess to a priest that you watched one god destroy another and did nothing to stop it? How do you explain that your silence made you complicit in a lie that the entire football world accepted as truth? The security footage had vanished within hours. Wiped clean, they said. Technical malfunction. The official report stated that both players had left the stadium without incident. Pelé gave interviews about the beautiful exhibition and his respect for Diego's artistry. Maradona stayed silent for 3 weeks, then returned to his club claiming he needed time to recover from a minor injury sustained during training. Carlos knew better. He'd seen the real injury. He'd watched one legend's carefully constructed image shatter like safety glass, and another's reputation get built on a foundation of violence and cover-ups. The worst part wasn't the secret itself. It was watching the world continue to worship them both. Every World Cup broadcast, every documentary, every statue unveiled in their honor felt like acid in his chest. Children wore their jerseys, stadiums bore their names, and Carlos swept grass clippings into neat piles, wondering if he was the only honest man left in football. He'd tried to convince himself that some truths were too dangerous to tell, that the beautiful game needed its heroes more than it needed facts, that destroying the legends would destroy something pure in millions of hearts around the world. But at 3 a.m, when sleep wouldn't come, those justifications felt as thin as the torn nets he replaced each season. The academy's first players wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, but Carlos heard footsteps on the gravel path behind him. Heavy boots, deliberate, someone who knew exactly where they were going. He turned to see a woman in her 30s approaching, camera bag slung over her shoulder, tablet in her hand. She had the determined walk of a journalist, the kind who'd already done her research and wasn't leaving without answers. Carlos Mendoza. Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place. European, maybe. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a documentary filmmaker. His blood went cold. After all these years, after convincing himself that the secret was buried so deep no one would ever dig it up, here was someone asking questions. His hands trembled as he set down the rake. I don't talk to reporters, he said, turning away. You'll have to leave. I'm not here about your refereeing career. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I'm here about what happened in the Maracana tunnel. June 15, 1987. Carlos felt the world tilt sideways. 36 years of careful silence, and now this stranger was speaking the date like a prayer. Like she knew. I don't know what you're talking about. The lie came automatically, but his voice cracked on the words. Elena pulled out her tablet and tapped the screen. Even from several feet away, Carlos could see the grainy black and white image that appeared. Security camera footage, 2 figures in a concrete tunnel, and something on the ground between them that made his knees nearly buckle. The footage wasn't destroyed, Carlos, Elena said softly. It was hidden, sold, traded through underground collectors for decades. I spent 3 years tracking down these clips, and another 6 months finding you. The tablet screen seemed to pulse with malevolent light. Carlos stared at the impossible image, proof of the secret that had poisoned half his lifetime. His ordinary world of grass stains and goalposts suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. What do you want? He whispered. Elena's smile was sharp as a referee's whistle. I want the truth about which one of your heroes is really the monster. Carlos closed his eyes, but the image burned behind his eyelids like a camera flash. When he opened them again, Elena was still there, still holding that damned tablet, still waiting for an answer he'd sworn he'd never give. There are no monsters here, he said, his voice barely audible above the morning traffic. Just an old man trying to tend his grass. Elena tucked the tablet away, but the damage was done. The carefully constructed walls Carlos had built around his new life were already crumbling. I know about your daughter, Carlos. Sofia, isn't it? Lives in Cordoba with her 3 children. Your grandchildren you see every Christmas. The mention of Sofia hit him like a tackle from behind. Carlos gripped the fence post to steady himself, feeling the rust flake off under his fingers. Leave my family out of this. I'm not threatening them. Elena's voice softened, and for a moment she sounded almost sympathetic. I'm asking you to think about what kind of world you want to leave them. One built on lies, or one where truth finally matters. Carlos thought about Sofia's laugh, the way it reminded him of her mother's. He thought about his grandson Miguel, 8 years old and already obsessed with football, begging Carlos to tell him stories about the famous players he'd refereed. The boy wore a Pelé jersey to every family dinner, his eyes wide with hero worship that made Carlos's stomach turn. You don't understand, Carlos whispered. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Are they? Even when innocent people suffer for them? Before Carlos could ask what she meant, the academy's side gate opened with its familiar squeak. Roberto Herrera emerged, jangling his keys, probably wondering why Carlos was talking to a stranger at dawn. Roberto was the academy's director, a former player whose knee injury had ended his career at 26. He'd hired Carlos 5 years ago, no questions asked about his past, offering only steady work and the kind of anonymity Carlos craved. Everything all right, Carlos? Roberto called out, his weathered face creased with concern. Elena stepped back, giving Carlos space to breathe, but her presence still felt like a weight on his chest. Just someone asking for directions, Carlos managed. Roberto nodded and headed toward the main building, but Carlos caught the worried glance he threw over his shoulder. In 5 years of working together, Roberto had learned to read the signs when Carlos's past came calling. Usually it was just old colleagues asking about ancient matches, seeking validation for disputed calls. Never this. Never security footage and whispered threats and the resurrection of dead secrets. I should go, Elena said, slipping a business card into Carlos's shirt pocket. But I'll be in Buenos Aires for 3 more days. Room 412 at the Hotel San Martin. Don't come back here, Carlos said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. They both knew she'd already accomplished what she came for. The seed was planted now, the doubt flourishing like weeds in well-tended soil. Think about your grandson, Elena said, walking backward toward the street. Think about what happens when he grows up and learns that his hero destroyed someone's life. Think about whether you want him to discover that truth from strangers or from the one person who was there, who saw everything. After she disappeared around the corner, Carlos stood alone in the growing daylight, feeling older than his 64 years. The familiar sounds of the academy waking up, Roberto opening windows, the groundskeeping crew arriving, the distant hum of the espresso machine in the small cafe next door, felt muffled, as if he were hearing them through water. He pulled out Elena's card. Simple white cardstock, her name in black ink, a phone number, nothing more. But it felt radioactive in his fingers. For 36 years he'd convinced himself that he was protecting people by staying silent, protecting the beautiful game, protecting the dreams of children who needed heroes to believe in. Now he wondered if he'd just been protecting himself. The first players would arrive soon, teenagers with scarred knees and impossible dreams, carrying worn cleats and their parents' hopes. Carlos loved watching them practice, their joy untainted by the corruption and violence that had poisoned his own relationship with the sport. They played for the pure love of it, the way he once had before he learned how easily legends could become monsters and witnesses could become accomplices. But Elena's words echoed in his mind. Think about what happens when he grows up and learns that his hero destroyed someone's life. Carlos pocketed the business card and picked up his rake, but his hands shook as he worked. The secret that had lived like a tumor in his chest for decades was already metastasizing, spreading into every corner of the life he'd built. By the time the sun fully rose over Buenos Aires, casting long shadows across the football pitch, Carlos Mendoza knew his quiet world was over. The only question now was whether he'd have the courage to control how it ended. Carlos tried to focus on the rake's familiar rhythm, but every stroke felt mechanical, disconnected from his trembling hands. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and drawing the scent of fresh grass into his nostrils, a smell that usually calmed him. Today it only reminded him how fragile peace could be. The academy came alive around him with its usual symphony of preparation. Roberto's radio crackled to life in the equipment shed, voices discussing team formations and practice schedules. The groundskeeping crew called out their morning greetings as they arrived, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who worked with their hands and slept well at night. Carlos envied them. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept through until dawn without jerking awake, sweat-soaked and gasping, the tunnel's fluorescent lights blazing behind his closed eyelids. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Roberto texting about field conditions or equipment needs. Carlos almost ignored it, but something made him pause and check the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made his blood turn to ice water. "We need to talk. Meet me at Café Luna in 1 hour. Come alone. DM." The rake slipped from his fingers, clattering against the concrete path. Those initials. After 36 years of silence, after decades of carefully avoiding each other's orbits, Diego Maradona was reaching out. But that was impossible. Diego was dead. Had been for 3 years now. Carlos had watched the funeral on television from his small apartment, tears streaming down his face as millions mourned a legend, while only Carlos grieved for the broken man he'd really known. His hands shook as he reread the message. The phone number showed a Buenos Aires area code. Someone was using Diego's name, playing games with information that should have been buried with both legends. Unless... Carlos's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Elena had said the footage was sold, traded through underground collectors. How many people knew? How many had seen what he'd witnessed in that tunnel? And why was someone claiming to be Diego contacting him now, just hours after Elena's visit? He tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. No greeting, just the automated message from the phone company. Carlos hung up without leaving a message, his breathing shallow and rapid. Café Luna was only 6 blocks away, a small neighborhood spot where Carlos sometimes bought coffee on his way home. He'd never seen it as anything more than a convenience, but now it felt like a trap. Who would be waiting for him there? What did they want? And how much did they really know about that night in 1987? Roberto emerged from the equipment shed, clipboard in hand, his usual smile fading when he saw Carlos's expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, amigo. What's wrong?" Carlos stared at the phone in his trembling hand. "Roberto, I need to leave for a few hours. Can you handle the morning setup?" "Of course, but..." "Don't ask questions. Please." Carlos was already walking toward the gate, his groundskeeper's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume that no longer fit. "I'll explain later. Maybe." He knew he wouldn't explain. How could he? How do you tell a man who dedicated his life to nurturing young talent that the sport they both loved was built on foundations of violence and lies? How do you admit that you'd spent decades protecting monsters while calling it noble silence? The walk to Café Luna felt endless and too short at the same time. Each step carried him further from the safe routine he'd built, and closer to a reckoning he'd spent 36 years avoiding. The morning crowds of Buenos Aires moved around him, commuters heading to work, students rushing to classes, street vendors setting up their stands, all of them living in a world where Pelé and Maradona were gods, not men capable of unspeakable acts. As he rounded the final corner, Carlos saw the cafe's familiar yellow awning and felt his stomach drop. Through the large front window, he could make out a figure sitting alone at a corner table back to the street. The build was wrong for Diego, too thin, too tall, but the person was wearing a blue Argentina jersey, number 10 clearly visible across the shoulders. Carlos stopped walking, his feet refusing to carry him any closer. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, go back to the academy, pretend the message had never arrived. But Elena's words echoed in his mind. Think about your grandson. Think about what happens when he grows up and learns that his hero destroyed someone's life. The figure in the cafe turned slightly, and Carlos caught a glimpse of profile through the window. It wasn't Diego, couldn't be Diego, but the resemblance was strong enough to make his knees weak. Family. Diego's family reaching out from beyond the grave. Carlos took a deep breath and pushed open the cafe door, knowing with absolute certainty that his old life had just ended forever. The cafe's bell chimed as Carlos entered, the sound sharp and accusatory in the morning quiet. Only 3 other customers occupied the small space: an elderly woman reading a newspaper, a young man hunched over a laptop, and the figure in the Argentina jersey who had summoned him here. As Carlos approached the corner table, the person turned fully around, and the resemblance to Diego hit him like a physical blow. Same dark eyes, same angular jawline, but younger, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who'd inherited athletic genes but chosen a different path. "Señor Mendoza." The man's voice carried Diego's porteño accent, but softer, more careful. "Thank you for coming. I'm Humiliate Maradona, Diego's nephew." Carlos remained standing, his hand gripping the back of the empty chair like an anchor. The family connection explained the resemblance, but not the terror creeping up his spine. "How did you get my number?" "Sit down, please." Matias gestured to the chair across from him, but Carlos didn't move. The younger man's calm demeanor felt wrong, rehearsed. "We have a lot to discuss." "I don't think we do." Carlos turned to leave, but Matias's next words froze him in place. "My uncle told me about the tunnel before he died." The cafe seemed to shrink around Carlos, the walls pressing closer with each heartbeat. He sank into the chair, legs no longer able to support him. "That's impossible." Matias pulled out his phone and set it on the table between them, screen down. He was terrified in those final months. The drugs, the drinking, everyone thought it was just Diego being Diego, but I knew him better than that. He was running from something, or someone. Carlos watched the other customers, searching for signs they were listening, recording, part of some elaborate trap. But the elderly woman remained absorbed in her newspaper, and the young man's fingers never paused on his keyboard. The world continued its normal rhythm, while Carlos's carefully constructed reality crumbled. "What did he tell you?" The question escaped before Carlos could stop it. Instead of answering directly, Matias flipped his phone over and tapped the screen. A voice recording began to play, Diego's voice, slurred but unmistakable, probably from one of his final hospital stays. There was a referee there. "Carlos something. He saw what Pelé did to me, saw everything, but he never said nothing, never helped me. Just watched while that bastard, the recording cut off in a fit of coughing." Carlos's vision blurred. Hearing Diego's voice again after all these years felt like being struck by lightning, painful and illuminating in equal measure. But there was something wrong with the timeline, something that didn't match his memories of that night. "Your uncle was confused," Carlos whispered. "The medication, the years of substance abuse." "Was he?" Matias leaned forward, his eyes sharp with an intelligence that reminded Carlos uncomfortably of Diego in his prime. "Because there's something else you should know. The woman who visited you this morning, Elena Vasquez, she's not working alone." The revelation hit Carlos like cold water. "What do you mean?" "She approached my family 6 months ago. said she had footage, evidence, wanted to make a documentary that would restore Diego's true legacy. But her real employer isn't some film company. Matias paused, studying Carlos's face. She works for the Pelé Foundation, has for 3 years. Carlos felt the ground shift beneath him. Elena's visit, her careful questions, the way she'd known exactly which pressure points to press. It had all been orchestrated. That doesn't make sense. Why would they want to? Think about it, Matias interrupted. Pelé's been sick for months. His family knows he's dying. And when he goes, what happens to his image, his foundation, his billion-dollar legacy? He leaned back in his chair, letting the implications settle. Unless, of course, there's a story that makes Diego look like the real monster, something that justifies decades of silence. The cafe's espresso machine hissed to life behind the counter, but Carlos barely heard it. His mind raced through the implications: Elena's visit, the conveniently surfaced footage, and now Diego's family emerging from years of silence. Everyone wanted to control the narrative, to shape the truth before it could shape them. "They're going to frame him," Carlos said, the words tasting like ash. "Use the footage to tell their version of the story. Only if you let them." Matias reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of Carlos's trembling fingers. "You were there. You're the only witness left alive. That makes you the most dangerous person in Buenos Aires right now." Through the cafe window, Carlos saw a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there when he arrived. 2 men sat in the front seats, their attention focused on the cafe's entrance. Not police. Their suits were too expensive, their posture too relaxed. Private security, maybe. Or worse. Carlos stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go." "Where?" Matias called after him. "Back to your academy? Your safe little routine? They know where you work, Carlos. They know where you live. The only safety you have left is the truth." But Carlos was already walking toward the rear exit, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that the men in the sedan were probably just the beginning.